When the Beverly Hillbillies first appeared on American television in 1962, it felt like nothing more than simple fun. The story was easy to understand. A poor family from the Ozark Mountains suddenly became rich after striking oil and moved into a huge mansion in Beverly Hills. Every week, viewers laughed as Jed Clampett and his family struggled to understand fancy manners, high society rules, and city life. The jokes were broad, the characters were lovable, and the humor felt safe for families. Critics at the time often dismissed the show as silly or shallow, but audiences didn't care. Millions tuned in faithfully, making it one of the most watched shows in television history. What most fans never realized, however, was that behind the bright smiles, exaggerated accents, and banjo music was a much deeper story, one filled with quiet frustration, creative limits, and personal sacrifices that never made it onto the screen. For the cast, the show was both a blessing and a trap. On one hand, it brought fame, job security, and a place in television history. On the other hand, it slowly took away their freedom to be seen as anything else. Buddy Ebsen, who played Jed Clampett, was already a seasoned performer long before the Beverly Hillbillies. He had danced in classic films, survived serious illness, and built a reputation as a versatile entertainer. When he accepted the role of Jed, he believed it would be temporary, just another stop in a long career. He never imagined that the character would follow him for the rest of his life. As the show's popularity exploded, the public stopped calling him Buddy. To them, he was simply Jed Clampett. No matter how many other roles he played, the hat, the slow drawl, and the country wisdom overshadowed everything else he had ever done. This experience was not unique to Ebsen. Donna Douglas, who played Ellie Mae Clampett, faced a different but equally painful struggle. Ellie Mae was kind, innocent, and endlessly cheerful, a character loved by children and admired by adults. Donna Douglas embraced the role with sincerity, but the industry refused to see past it. Casting directors struggled to imagine her as anyone other than the country girl who talked to animals. Offers that came her way often demanded she abandon the values that made Ellie Mae special. Douglas chose to protect her image, even when it cost her opportunities. To fans, she seemed eternally happy. In reality, she was quietly carrying the weight of difficult choices that shaped the rest of her life. Behind the scenes, the pressure was constant. The producers and network executives wanted one thing above all else: consistency. As long as ratings stayed high, there was no reason to change the formula. Any suggestion of deeper storytelling, emotional growth, or character development was brushed aside. The show was not meant to evolve. It was meant to repeat what already worked. For creative performers, this was painful. They understood their characters well enough to know there was more beneath the surface, but they were rarely allowed to explore it. Over time, many stopped trying. They learned their lines, hit their marks, and smiled for the camera, even as frustration quietly grew. What made the situation especially difficult was how little control the cast had over their futures. Contracts in that era were strict and unforgiving. Despite starring in one of the most successful shows on television, the actors received no royalties from reruns. As the show continued to make money for the network for decades, the people who brought it to life saw none of it. Loyalty kept them together. They supported one another privately, knowing they were all facing the same invisible wall. To the public, they were symbols of joy and simplicity. Behind closed doors, they were artists struggling to hold on to their identities in an industry that preferred them frozen in time. This contrast between laughter and loss, fame and limitation, is what makes the Beverly Hillbillies so powerful in hindsight. The show wasn't just a comedy about culture clash. It became a reflection of Hollywood itself, a place that celebrates success while quietly restricting those who achieve it. For decades, fans laughed without ever suspecting the emotional cost paid by the people they adored. Only years later, through interviews and memories, did the fuller picture begin to emerge. And once you see it, it becomes impossible to watch the show the same way again as the success of the Beverly Hillbillies grew. So did the gap between how the audience saw the cast and how the cast saw themselves. On television, everything looked carefree. The Clampetts laughed easily, solved problems by the end of each episode, and always returned to their familiar routines. Off camera, however, the actors were slowly realizing that the same routines bringing them fame were also limiting their futures. Hollywood had a habit of locking performers into a single image, and no amount of talent could break that spell once it took hold. For the cast of the Beverly Hillbillies, this became their quiet, shared burden. Buddy Ebsen felt this weight more strongly with each passing season. Early on, he tried to bring subtle depth to Jed Clampett. He imagined Jed as a man shaped by hardship, someone who had lived a full life before striking oil. Ebsen believed that even a simple character could carry traces of past struggles and wisdom. At times, he suggested small changes to the script, pauses in dialogue, quieter moments, hints of memory from Jed's life in the hills. These ideas were almost always rejected. The producers worried that anything too thoughtful might confuse the audience or weaken the comedy. They wanted laughs, not reflection. Eventually, Ebsen stopped pushing. He later described the role as steady work rather than creative fulfillment, a job that paid the bills but slowly narrowed how the world saw him. Donna Douglas faced similar limits, though her experience carried a different kind of pressure. As Ellie Mae, she became a symbol of innocence during a decade of social change. Fans adored her sweetness and sincerity, and Douglas felt a strong responsibility to protect that image. Studio executives, however, often encouraged a move in a more glamorous direction. They believed her beauty could be used in ways that conflicted with her personal beliefs. Douglas refused many offers, knowing each rejection pushed her further away from mainstream Hollywood success. While she never spoke publicly with anger, those close to her understood the frustration she carried. She was choosing principle over opportunity, even when it meant closing doors that might never reopen. Max Baird Jr., who played Jethro Bodine, experienced the most extreme form of typecasting. Jethro was written as simple-minded, loud, and clueless, a character designed to generate easy laughs. Baird played the role with enthusiasm and intelligence, carefully crafting physical comedy that audiences loved. Off-screen, he was thoughtful and ambitious, with strong interests in business and production. Yet casting agents saw only Jethro. Meetings ended quickly. Scripts were not offered. Executives laughed at his desire to be taken seriously. For years, he struggled against the idea that the character's foolishness reflected his own abilities. Despite these frustrations, the cast maintained a strong sense of loyalty to one another. They understood that none of them were alone in their struggle. The long hours, tight schedules, and constant public attention created a bond that outsiders rarely noticed. Even when tensions arose, especially during stressful filming days, there was an unspoken understanding that everyone was fighting the same system. Their smiles during interviews were not fake, but they were incomplete. What viewers saw was only the polished surface. Financially, the situation was just as painful. Although the Beverly Hillbillies was one of the highest-rated shows on television, the cast earned far less than modern audiences might expect. Contracts signed early in the show's run did not include rerun payments or profit sharing. As episodes replayed year after year, generating enormous revenue, the actors saw none of it. Donna Douglas later spoke about this with calm honesty, explaining that they were grateful for the work, but unaware how little control they had over their long-term security. The laughter they created enriched others far more than it enriched themselves. Looking back, it becomes clear that the Beverly Hillbillies succeeded not because it was shallow, but because the performers brought sincerity to even the simplest jokes. They gave warmth to characters that could have easily become cruel caricatures. The tragedy is that this same sincerity made it harder for them to escape those roles later. The show gave them everything and quietly took just as much away. This contradiction is what most fans never figure out while tuning in week after week, unaware of the personal costs hidden behind the humor. While the cast struggled with typecasting and limited creative freedom, the true power behind the Beverly Hillbillies rested with the network and producers who controlled every major decision. Paul Henning, the show's creator, had a clear and simple vision from the beginning. He wanted the Clampetts to remain honest, uncomplicated people placed in an unfamiliar world. The humor came from contrast, not cruelty. For the most part, Henning protected that vision. But as ratings climbed higher and higher, network influence grew stronger. CBS executives saw the show not as a story, but as a reliable machine that printed money. Their priority was not artistic growth, but stability. Anything that threatened the formula was quietly shut down. This tension became more noticeable as the years passed. Some writers and cast members believed the show could slowly evolve while still keeping its humor. They suggested storylines that explored class differences more deeply or allowed characters to change slightly with time. These ideas rarely made it past early discussions. The network feared that growth would alienate viewers who tuned in for familiarity. As a result, the Clampetts were frozen in place. No matter how many years passed, they were expected to remain the same people who first arrived in Beverly Hills, untouched by experience or reflection. Buddy Ebsen found this especially difficult. With decades of experience in entertainment, he understood that audiences could handle more emotional range than executives believed. He occasionally pushed for moments where Jed's wisdom felt earned rather than accidental. In private conversations, he explained that a man like Jed would have lived through hardship, loss, and responsibility long before striking oil. These suggestions were often met with polite smiles and quick rewrites. According to former crew members, Ebsen eventually stopped offering input altogether. He arrived on set prepared, delivered his lines, and left without argument. The passion he once felt for the craft slowly gave way to resignation. Tension also existed among the cast themselves, though it rarely surfaced publicly. Irene Ryan, who played Granny, was a seasoned performer with a strong theatrical background. She approached comedy with precision and timing, believing every line had a purpose. Max Baird Jr., by contrast, enjoyed improvisation and physical comedy, sometimes adjusting his delivery in the moment. While their on-screen chemistry was undeniable, this difference in style occasionally caused friction. Crew members later recalled moments when Ryan felt her carefully built punchlines were disrupted. Although these disagreements never exploded into open conflict, they added another layer of stress to an already demanding environment. Despite these challenges, the cast shared a quiet understanding of their situation. They knew they were part of something enormous, something that connected with millions of viewers across generations. That knowledge created a sense of responsibility. Even on difficult days, they showed up ready to perform. They understood that for many families, the Beverly Hillbillies was more than entertainment. It was a ritual, a moment of shared laughter in a changing world. This awareness kept them moving forward, even when personal satisfaction was lacking. The financial realities only deepened the strain. Unlike modern television contracts, there's offered little protection once the show ended. Reruns, which would later become a massive source of income for networks, brought no additional compensation. As years passed and the show continued to air worldwide, the cast watched others profit from work they could no longer control. Still, few complained publicly. At the time, such arrangements were considered normal, and challenging them risked being labeled difficult or ungrateful. What makes this period so striking in hindsight is how much restraint the cast showed. They could have turned bitter or disengaged, yet they continued to give performances filled with warmth and sincerity. The simplicity audiences loved was not accidental. It was carefully maintained by professionals who understood the emotional balance required to keep the show from becoming mean-spirited. The irony is that this professionalism, this willingness to put the show above personal ambition, ultimately made it harder for them to escape its shadow. The system rewarded obedience more than growth, and the Beverly Hillbillies became both their greatest success and their greatest limitation as the series moved deeper into its long run. The emotional toll on the cast became harder to hide, even if the audience never noticed it. Playing the same exaggerated versions of themselves year after year required more energy than most viewers realized. Comedy, especially broad comedy, demanded precision, timing, and emotional control. For the cast of the Beverly Hillbillies, this meant constantly delivering joy while quietly setting aside their own fatigue and frustrations. Irene Ryan's experience as Granny is one of the clearest examples of this hidden cost. Though Granny appeared fierce, loud, and unstoppable on screen, Ryan herself was battling serious health issues behind the scenes. She was older than most of her castmates and often physically exhausted, yet she refused to slow down. She believed deeply in professionalism and felt a personal duty to never disappoint the audience. There were moments when production staff suggested rewriting scenes to give Ryan lighter work, but she rejected those offers. She insisted on performing every line as written, often pushing herself far beyond what doctors recommended. Fellow cast members later recalled seeing her arrive on set pale and weak, only to transform the moment the cameras rolled. Once filming ended, That strength would fade, and the physical strain would return. The public never saw this side of Granny. To them, she was pure fire and humor. In reality, she was sacrificing her health to maintain the character's energy and spirit. Donna Douglas carried a quieter burden. While Ellie Mae was joyful and carefree, Douglas was dealing with personal struggles that rarely surface in interviews. Her marriage was under strain, and the pressure from the studio to change her image never fully disappeared. Douglas felt torn between her personal beliefs and the expectations of the entertainment industry. She worried about disappointing fans who saw Ellie Mae as a symbol of kindness and innocence, especially young girls who admired the character. Rather than speak openly about her struggles, Douglas chose silence. She believed the show was not the place for her pain, and she kept her private life carefully hidden. Max Baird Jr., meanwhile, was growing increasingly restless. Though he enjoyed making people laugh, he feared that Jethro's exaggerated foolishness would define him forever. He began studying directing and production on his own time, hoping to prepare for a future beyond acting. These efforts were often dismissed by those in power. Studio executives found it difficult to take his ambitions seriously, assuming the character reflected the man. This misunderstanding followed him long after the show ended, creating obstacles that took years to overcome. Even Buddy Ebsen, who appeared calm and steady, was not untouched by sorrow. Crew members recalled moments when Ebsen seemed distant during filming, as if lost in thought. In later interviews, it became clear that personal loss sometimes blended into a performance. Subtle pauses, thoughtful looks, and quiet moment of reflection occasionally slipped into Jed Clampett's character. Viewers often interpreted these as wise, gentle acting choices, unaware that they were sometimes rooted in real grief. The line between performance and personal emotion grew thin. Even when no one intended it to, what made these struggles especially painful was a lack of acknowledgement. Mental and emotional health were rarely discussed openly in that era. Actors were expected to be grateful, resilient, and silent. Complaining was seen as weakness, and taking breaks was often viewed as unprofessional. The cast learned to endure rather than express. They leaned on each other quietly, sharing understanding looks and private conversations that never reached the press. Despite everything, the show continued to present a world untouched by hardship. Each episode ended neatly, with laughter restoring balance. This contrast between fiction and reality is part of what makes the Beverly Hillbillies so haunting in retrospect. The cast was not simply acting happy. They were protecting the illusion for millions of viewers who depended on it. In doing so, they paid a personal price that remained hidden for decades. The longer the show ran, the more deeply this pattern became ingrained. Smiles replaced honesty, routine replaced growth, and silence replaced protest. Yet it was this very discipline that allowed the series to endure. The cast understood that their work mattered, even if their struggles were unseen. And while fans laughed freely, unaware of the sacrifices being made, the performers carried on, holding together a fragile balance between art and survival that few outside the studio walls ever truly understood. One of the most surprising truths about the Beverly Hillbillies is how carefully its creators and cast used simplicity to hide deeper meaning. On the surface, the show appeared to celebrate wealth as a solution to all problems. The Clampetts were poor, then suddenly rich, and their lives changed overnight. But beneath that surface, the series quietly questioned whether money truly brought belonging or happiness. This idea was subtle and easy to miss, yet appeared again and again in small details that most viewers never stopped to examine. The Clampetts lived in a mansion, but they rarely called a home. Instead, they referred to it as that house in Beverly Hills, a phrase that carried more meaning than it seemed. It suggested distance, discomfort, and a feeling of never fully fitting in, no matter how much money they had. This choice was not accidental. Writers and cast members understood that the Clampetts were visitors in a world that did not truly accept them. Their wealth opened doors, but it did not erase cultural divides. Jed Clampett remained polite and generous, yet he was often treated as an outsider by high society. Granny openly rejected Beverly Hills customs, clinging fiercely to her mountain roots. Ellie Mae's kindness stood in contrast to the vanity around her. These traits were played for laughs, but they also reflected a quiet resistance to the idea that success meant abandoning one's values. In this way, The show delivered gentle criticism wrapped in humor, allowing it to pass unnoticed by those who expected nothing more than entertainment. The cast related deeply to this theme. Just as the Clampett struggled to belong in Beverly Hills, the actors struggled to belong in Hollywood beyond their roles. Fame gave them access, but not freedom. They were welcomed as characters, not as individuals. This parallel was rarely discussed publicly, but influenced how the cast approached their performances. They played their characters with sincerity, never mocking them or treating them as foolish stereotypes. This choice gave the show its warmth and longevity. The audience laughed, but they also cared. Max Baird Jr. later explained that playing Jethro required intelligence and discipline. Physical comedy demanded control, planning, and awareness. Though Jethro appeared clueless, Baird understood every movement and reaction. He studied classic comedians and incorporated subtle techniques into his performance. Most viewers never noticed these details, but they contributed to the character's lasting appeal. Years later, Baird joked that pretending to be unintelligent for so long required constant focus. His humor masked a deeper frustration, one shared by many performers who felt underestimated by the industry. Donna Douglas's experience reflected a different form of quiet strength. She remained loyal to Ellie Mae's image long after the cameras stopped rolling. Rather than reinvent herself to chase fame, she chose a path that aligned with her beliefs. Douglas became a speaker, author, and singer, often visiting places far removed from Hollywood glamour. She spoke about self-respect, faith, and staying true to oneself. To her, Ellie Mae was not a limitation but a responsibility. She understood the impact the character had on viewers and chose to honor it, even when the industry moved on. Buddy Ebsen, too, carried away reflection as years passed. In later interviews, he spoke thoughtfully about legacy and acceptance. He acknowledged the frustration of being remembered for a single role, yet he also recognized the joy it brought to others. This balance defined much of his later life. He did not reject Jed Clampett, but he no longer allowed resentment to dominate his feelings. Instead, he viewed the character as part of a larger journey, one that shaped him in ways both painful and meaningful. In the end, the Beverly Hillbillies endured because it was built on honesty beneath exaggeration. The laughter was real, but so were the sacrifices. The show offered comfort during uncertain times, and the cast delivered that comfort even when it cost them personally. What fans never fully understood was that the simplicity they loved was carefully protected by people who knew complexity all too well. Behind every joke was discipline. Behind every smile was effort. And behind every episode was a group of performers quietly holding on to their values in an industry that rarely made room for them. When the Beverly Hillbillies came to an end in 1971, its conclusion was as quiet as much of its hidden history. There was no grand farewell, no special tribute episode, and no celebration of the people who had helped shape one of the most successful television shows of its time. The series was canceled as part of CBS's now famous Rural Purge, a decision driven by changing tastes and advertising goals rather than declining popularity. Shows that focus on rural or small-town life were suddenly seen as outdated, regardless of their loyal audiences. For the cast of the Beverly Hillbillies, this decision felt abrupt and deeply personal. One day they were central to American entertainment, and the next they were simply replaced. The sudden ending left many of the actors unprepared for what came next. Hollywood moved quickly, and once a show ended, attention shifted elsewhere. Buddy Ebsen was one of the few who managed to find steady work again, later starring in Barnaby Jones. Even then, he could not fully escape the shadow of Jed Clampett. Fans continued to associate him with the character, often calling him by Jed's name rather than his own. In interviews later in life, Ebsen spoke honestly about this struggle. He accepted that legacy was not something performers could always control, only something they learned to live with. Donna Douglas chose a different path entirely. Disillusioned by Hollywood's expectations, she stepped away from acting and focused on work that felt meaningful to her. She became involved in faith-based projects, writing books and speaking to audiences who admired her strength and values. Douglas never spoke bitterly about her time on the Beverly Hillbillies. Instead, she framed it as a chapter that allowed her to touch people's lives in ways she never expected. When asked if she resented being typecast, she famously replied that not everyone gets a chance to make people happy for generations. For her, that was enough. Max Baird Jr.'s post-show journey was marked by persistence. Determined to prove he was more than Jethro, he invested in business ventures and worked behind the camera. Some efforts succeeded, others failed, but his determination never faded. He remained protective of the show's legacy, often defending it against critics who dismissed it as shallow. Baird understood that while the humor was broad, the heart of the show was sincere. He believed the cast never mocked the characters they played, and that respect was the reason audiences connected so deeply. Irene Ryan did not live long enough to see how beloved her performance as Granny would become. She passed away in 1973, only 2 years after the show ended. Her death deeply affected her former castmates, who remembered her as tireless and devoted. What many fans never knew was that Ryan left a significant portion of her estate to support acting students. Through scholarships, she quietly ensured that future performers would have opportunities she herself had fought hard to earn. This final act reflected the generosity and dedication that defined her life and career. Today, the legacy of the Beverly Hillbillies lives on in reruns, streaming platforms, and cultural memory. New generations continue to discover the show, often drawn in by its humor, without realizing the deeper stories beneath it. What has emerged over time is a more complete picture of a series built on contradiction.